Okay, good morning, everybody. So this is Introduction to Literature, and we are going to discuss the plot as part of the fiction because this part that we are dealing with or that we are discussing is called fiction, and we will discuss plot in fiction, okay? So what is a plot? Sometimes you come across the word plot, but you don't know what it means. So now we will discuss what the plot means and what are the basic components of plot. Okay, so let's go to page number 85, and I'll read and discuss, the pages here. Okay. Uh, at its most basic, every story is an attempt to answer the question, what happened? In some cases, the question is easy to answer. In J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings trilogy is full of battles, chases, and other heart-stopping dramatic action. Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn relates Huck and Jim's adventures as they travel down the Mississippi River. Yet, if we ask what happened in other works of fiction, our initial answer might be, well, not much. In one of the most pivotal scenes in Henry James' novel, The Portrait of a Lady, for example, a woman enters a room, sees a man sitting down and a woman standing up, and beats a hasty retreat. Not terribly exciting stuff, it would seem. Yet this event ends up radically transforming the lives of just about everyone in the novel. On a very tiny bevets do human lives turn, would thus seem to be one common message or theme of fiction. So what this paragraph is telling us about is that, whenever we read any story, the question that comes to our mind is what happened, okay? And what will happen also, okay? So, and that's one of the basic things about the short story is that to ask this question, what happened, okay? So that, you want to know the events of the story when you ask this question. Okay. So the second paragraph, all fiction, regardless of its subject matter, should make us ask what will happen next and how will all this turn out. And responsive readers of fiction will often pose to answer these questions, trying to articulate just what their expectations are and how the story has happened to them, has shaped them. But great fiction and responsive readers are often just as interested in the question of why things happen and about how the characters lives affected as a result. These how and why questions are likely to be answered very differently by the readers of the very same fictional work. As a result, such questions will often generate powerful essays, whereas mainly factual questions, what happened in the work, usually won't. Okay, so what is this paragraph is telling us is that when you read a fictional work, okay, there are three questions that you have to ask. What will happen? How will it happen and how it happened and why it happened? Now, if you ask this question, what will happen, then you are looking for the story. So this is concerned with the story, okay, itself. And this is very simple and naive when you ask what happened, okay? That's the basic thing that is in a story. But the most important questions that you will have to ask is how will all this turn out? So you have to ask how and why, okay? So if you go beyond what will happen and go to the questions how it happened and why it happened, then you are dealing with the plot itself. So simply, if we want to distinguish between a story and a plot, okay, So the story is concerned with what happened, okay? That's the easiest and simplest way. That's the easiest and simplest way. Let me put it here. But the plot is concerned with how and why it happened or will happen. Okay? So if you ask why or how, then you are talking about the plot. If you are asking about what, then you are talking about the story. So that's the difference between the story and the plot. Okay. Now the second thing that we have to talk about here is plot versus action, sequence, and subplot. So in a plot, we have to distinguish between a plot and action, sequence, and subplot. Sometimes we have a plot and we have smaller plots that we call them subplots. We will talk about them in detail now. The term plot is sometimes, just a minute. The term plot is sometimes used to refer to the events recounted in a fictional work. But in this book, we instead use the term action in this way, reserving the term plot for the way the author sequences and paces the events so as to shape our responses and interpretations. Okay, so here it is very interesting that here we have a kind of a definition for the plot. So the plot here, the definition of the plot is that the way the author, sorry. So the way the author sequences and paces the events so as to shape our responses and interpretation of the work. That is called a plot, okay? That's called a plot. The difference between action and plot resembles the difference between ancient chronicles that merely list the events of a king's reign in chronological order and more modern histories that make a meaningful sequence out of those events. As the British novel and critic Ian Forster put it, "The king died, then the queen died" is not a plot, for it has not been tampered with. The queen died after the king died describe the same events, but the order in which they are reported has been changed. The reader of the first sentence focuses on the king first, the reader of the second on the queen. The second sentence, moreover, subtly encourages us to speculate about why things happen, not just what happened and when. Did the queen die because her husband did? If so, was her death the result of her grief? Or was she murdered by a rival who saw the king's death as the perfect opportunity to get rid of her too? Though our two sentences describe the same action, each has quite a different focus, emphasis, effect, meaning, thanks to its sequence, the precise order in which the events are related. Okay, so let me go back and explain this in detail so you can understand what's going on here. So here we have the difference between action and plot. Simply action when you report things that happened as history, okay? For example, you say X died and then Y died. So you are reporting a history. Now the plot goes beyond history, goes beyond action. It's not about action. It's about the author who deals with the story and try to change it. Now look at this first, okay, so so look at this sentence. The king died and then the queen died. This is a kind of a sequence of action, okay? So we have the action, the king died and then the queen died. So this is not a plot. Why? Because we don't see the authors, tampering or dealing with this sentence. But if you look at the next one, the queen died after the king died. Here, the word after is very significant, you know, because the addition of the word after means that there is reason behind the death of the queen. Okay, now this is a plot because it allows us to think and it allows us to ask why. It allows us to ask why and how rather than what happened. So if you look at the first sentence, if you ask what happened, you say the king died and then the queen died. That's what happened. Then this is not a plot. But if you ask why the queen died after the king died, or how the queen died after the king died. Now, if you ask how and why, then this is a plot. If you ask what, then this is not a plot, but it's a story with, or it's an action here. All right, so yeah, so the next page, which is page number 2, we will go and discuss, like Chronicles, many fictional works do relate events in chronological order, starting with the earliest and ending with the latest. Folk tales, for example, have this sort of plot, but fiction writers have other choices, even needed not to be recounted this particular order in which they happened. Quite often then, a writer will choose to mix things up, perhaps opening a story with the most recent event and then moving backward to show us all that lead to it. Still, other stories begin somewhere in the middle of the action, or to use the Latin term, in media res, literally in the middle of things. In such plots, even events that occurred before the story's opening are sometimes presented in flashbacks. Conversely, a story might jump forward in time to recount later episode or event in the flash forward. Foreshadowing occurs when an author merely gives subtle clues on hints about what will happen later in the story. Okay, so here we have some terms that you have to be aware of and you have to familiarize yourself. Okay, the first term is in media res. And the second term is flashback. And then we have a flash forward. And then we have also a term called foreshadowing. Okay, these are very important terms that you have to pay attention to. And I'll explain them now to you in detail. First of all, you have to understand that when we talk about a plot, you think that the plot has a sequence of events that starts from the beginning, go to the middle, and it finishes in the end. But that's not true. For example, I'll give you an example. I'm sure that many of you watched movies and watched series in TVs, right? Sometimes when you watch a series, it starts in the middle of the action. Sometimes it goes back to the past and then go to the present. Sometimes it starts with the future and go back to the present. So it is not like, you know, a sequence of events from the past to the present to the future. Sometimes you start with the future and then you go back to the present and the past. Or sometimes you start with the present, you go to the future, and then you go to the past. So simply the arrangement of the plot can change depending on the author's choice and the author's preference, okay? So here, if you look here in the second line, folk tales, for example, have this sort of plot. The plot that what? That has a chronological order, okay? What do we mean by chronological order? Chronological order means that you arrange the plot in a sequential order, okay? You arrange the plot, okay? You arrange the plot in a sequential order. That's called that's the plot that you find in folk tales, like the tales that you got from your parents and grandparents. You'll find a folk tales that start with the past, go to the present, and then finishes in the future. This is called chronological order. يعني اللي هو الترتيب الزمني بيبدأ بالماضي بيذهب إلى الحاضر بعدين بينتقل للمستقبل. هاي الفولك تيلز اللي هي القصص اللي بيحكوا لنا إياها آبائنا وأجدادنا بشكل خاص. But لكن هذه الفولك تيلز ليس البلot not all the time can be found in folk tales. Fiction writers here have other choices. events need not to be recounted in this particular order in which they happen. Quite often then a writer will choose to mix things up. يعني الكاتب ممكن يخلط الكرونولوجي اللي هو المقصود فيها ال past وال present وال future. Perhaps opening a story with the most recent events. يعني هون بيبدأ ممكن بالإيش اللي هو ال present. ماشي. And then moving backward to show us all that led to it. Okay, and then go to the future. Still other stories begin somewhere in the middle of the action. To use the Latin term in media res. So in media res here, this is the definition of in media res. Still other stories begin in the middle of the action. Somewhere in the middle of the action, it's called in media res. And this is a Latin term. So this means that if the story starts in the middle and then go to the past or the future, this is called in media res. For example, if you start the story with the death of someone, okay, and then you go back and you ask or you try to find why this person died, this is called in media res. Why? Because we start with the middle of the action and then we go back to it. And in media res here literally mean in the middle of things. In such plots, events that occur before the story's opening are sometimes represented as flashbacks. So flashbacks, I think you are familiar with the flashbacks. And it refers to you know, when you start the story or you have certain events that are referring to the past. So if you go to the past, this is called flashback. If you go to the future, this is called flash forward. So the flashback, it means that you go back to the past events, okay? That's called flashbacks. But if you jump forward in time, this is called flash forward. So jumping backward means flashback. Jumping forward means flash forward. For example, I'll give you an example. If you start a story with the birth of the child, no, okay. Let's say you start the story with the death of someone, but then all of a sudden you go back to his birth. That's called flashback because you go back to his birth. But the story starts in his death. But if you go and talk about his birth, this is called flashback. Now, if you talk about the future, okay, something that will happen to that person in the future, okay, that's, for example, what will happen to his family, okay, before we know that he's gonna die, this is called flash forward. So flashback, events that talk about the past or scenes that are related to the past, and flash forwards are scenes that are related to the future. Now, foreshadowing, excuse me. Foreshadowing occurs when an author merely gives a subtle clue or hint about what will happen later in the story. So while we are reading the story, there are certain clues or certain, you know, signs or certain things that tell us that there is something that will happen in the future, that something will occur in the future, okay? And this is, you know, or this refers to foreshadowing. So foreshadowing is when we have clues, signs, hints that lead us to some events in the future, and this is called, you know, foreshadowing. So these terms, flashback, forwards, and foreshadowing, are very important, and you have to, you know, pay attention to. Okay, so though we often talk about the plot of fictional work, however, keep in mind that some works, especially longer ones, have two or more. A plot that receives significantly less time and attention than another is called a subplot. So here, the last thing that we have to know here in the plot is that we have a plot and subplot. So the plot is the main structure of the story, okay? But the subplot, sometimes you have a plot within a plot, or sometimes you have a smaller plot within a plot. This small plot is called subplot. Okay. For example, if you read a story about the death of the king, okay, and the whole story talk about the death of king, for example, King Lear. The whole story talk about the death of King Lear, the death of this king. But within this story, you have another story or another subplot that talks about another person. For example, about a farmer who's living in a farm, and we have like a very short story. This is called subplot. So plot is the bigger one, and subplot is the smaller one, and this is within the plot itself. Okay. Pace. In life, we sometimes have little choices or choice about how long a particular event lasts. If you want a driver's license, you have to spend a boring hour or two at the motor vehicle office. And much as you might prefer to relax and enjoy your lunch, occasionally you have to scarf it down in the 10 minutes it takes you to drive to canvas. One of the pleasures of turning experiences into story, however, is that doing so gives a writer more power over them. In addition to choosing the order in which to recount events, the writer can also decide how much time and attention to devote to each. Pacing or the duration of a particular episode, especially relative to each other and to the time they would have taken in real life, is a vital tool of storytelling and another important factor to consider in analyzing plots. In all fiction, pace as much as sequence determines focus and emphasis, effect and meaning. And though it can be very helpful to differentiate between fast-paced and slow-paced fiction, all effective stories contain faster and slower bits. When author slow down to home in a particular moment and scene, often introduces by phrase such as later that evening or the day before Maggie fell down. We call this a discriminated occasion. For example, the first paragraph of Linda verse quickly and generally refers to the events that occur over 3 days. Okay, I think this is, I don't think this is you need to know. It's not like, a big thing that you need to worry about. So skip this, okay? Guys, skip this. The whole paragraph, skip it. Okay, let me just highlight. The pace is not very important to know, okay? So just skip it. All right, so we'll go to the next page, which is the conflict. The conflict is very important, okay? Most of the time, not all the time, stories have conflicts, okay? Whatever their sequence and pace, all plots hinge on at least one all plots hinge on at least one conflict, some sort of struggle and resolution. So that's the definition of a conflict. So it's a kind of a struggle with a resolution. Conflicts may be external or internal. Okay, these are types of conflicts, can be external or internal. External conflicts, and this is the explanation, arise between characters and sometimes someone outside themselves, okay? Like, for example, we have a conflict between X and Y. This is an external conflict. Adventure stories and films often present this sort of conflict in its purest form, keeping up poised on the edge of our seats as James Bond struggled to outwit an arch villain intent on world domination and destruction. Yet external conflict can be much subtler, pitted an individual against nature or fate, against social force such as racism or poverty, or against another person or group of people with different way of looking at things. So here is the difference between so here this is an explanation also of the external conflict, and the author says here external conflicts can also be much subtler, pitted an individual against nature or fate, against a social force such as racism or poverty, or against another person or a group of people with different way of looking at things. So simply the conflict is not necessary to be between a person and a person. Sometimes a conflict, external conflict between a person and nature, a person and social force, a person and racism, a person and poverty. So this kind of external conflict, can be, very complicated and subtler when it from the word subtle. This is the word subtle, okay? So it can be an individual who is set against nature or fate or against social force or against racism. This is still, the uh, the external conflict. Okay, so let's go now to the internal conflict. Now, the internal conflict occurs when characters struggle to reconcile competing desires, and this is, the definition is when characters, struggle to reconcile two competing desires, needs, duties, and or two aspects or parts of himself. Okay, so simply internal is a conflict within the character, him or herself. Okay, while external conflict is that the conflict between a character and external force. For example, you can have a conflict with nature, with fate, with racism, with an individual or the group. This is called external conflict. Now, internal conflict is a conflict with yourself, okay? It's a conflict to reconcile two competing desires, needs, and duties. And desires, needs, and duties can be within you as a person, okay? Not something external, and that's the difference, all right? His head, for instance, might tell him to do one thing, his heart another. Now, the head and the heart are internal things, right? They're not external. A conflict is simultaneously external and internal, as in the following brief folk tale, in which a woman seems to struggle simultaneously with nature, with immorality, with God, and with her desire to hold on to someone she loves versus her need to let go. Okay, so here's the story. It's called The Shroud, okay? And we have both conflicts, the external conflict and the internal conflicts. And we will look at this story and see how this conflict, can be explained. There was once a mother who had a little boy of 7 years old, who was so handsome and lovable that no one could look at him without liking him. And she herself worshipped him above everything in the world. Now it so happened that he suddenly became ill, and God took him to himself. And for this, the mother could not be comforted, and wept both day and night. But soon afterward, when the child had been buried, it appeared by night in the places where it had sat and played during its life. And if the mother wept, it wept also. And when morning came, it disappeared. As however the mother would not stop crying, it came one night in the little white shroud in which it had been laid in its coffin, and with its wreath of flowers around his head. And stood on the bed at her feet and said, "Oh, mother, do stop crying, or I shall never fall asleep in my coffin, for my shroud will not dry because of all thy tears which fall upon it." The mother was afraid when she heard that, and wept no more. The next night the child came again and held a little light in its hand and said, "Look, mother, my shroud is nearly dry, and I can rest in my grave." Then the mother gave her sorrow into God's keeping, and bore it quietly and patiently, and the child came no more, but slept in the little bed beneath the earth. So simply here in this story, we see that we have the mother and God. God takes the child from the mother, right? So now the conflict is between the mother and the God, right? That's the external conflict. Now the internal conflict is that the mother, tried to cry and tried to be sad because of this loss, the loss of her child. Now, so the internal conflict is her sadness and her feelings and desires about the loss of this child. This is internal. Now, the external is that her conflict with God or with nature, because simply the child is taken from her and because the child died. Okay. All right, so let's go to page number 5. Okay, now here we have to look at the 5 parts of the plot. And this is very important, guys, because this is the explanation for your assignments. Because in the assignments, I asked you to read the short story, a story of an hour, and to locate the 5 parts of the plot. Now I will explain the 5 parts of the plot, and your role in the assignments is to locate these parts in the short story that I give, and then we will discuss them, you know, later on together. Okay. All right. Even compact and simple plots like that of The Shroud have the same 5 parts or phases as length and complex plot. Now, these are the 5 parts of the plots: the exposition, the rising action, the climax or turning point, the falling action, and the conclusion or resolution. Okay, so these are the 5 parts of the plot. The following diagram, named Freytag pyramid after the 19th century German scholar Gustav Freytag, maps out the typical plot structure. So when you look at this pyramid, you will see the plot structure. The plot starts with the exposition here, and then we have the rising action. When the action starts to get complicated, okay, that's called the rising action. Now, the action becomes more complicated and complicated until we reach the climax. The climax, this is the highest point in the plot or the story. For example, the death of someone, the loss of someone, the most tragic thing in the story. For example, the previous story, The Shroud, the death of the child is the climax, right? Because the mother now starts crying on her child. So that's called the climax. Now, the falling action, when the action starts to get less intense and less serious and less, you know, complicated, this is called the falling action. And then we end with the conclusion or the end of the story. So these are the 5 parts of the plot. We have the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and then we end with the conclusion. Now, the rest will be an explanation for this pyramid. I'll go and explain them now in detail. Okay, now look here, exposition. Exposition is the first part of the plot, and called the exposition introduces the characters, and here's the definition. It introduces the characters, their situations, and usually a time or a place giving us all the basic information that we need to understand what is to come. So this is the exposition. Exposition is simply the introduction. In longer works of fiction, exposition may go on for one paragraph or even pages, and some exposition may well be deferred until later phases of the plot. But in our examples, the exposition is all up front and brief. Introduced first panel shows us teacher, or at least these words, a group of students and a classroom. The Grimm's first sentence introduces a mother, her young son, and the powerful love she feels. So if you remember now, the story that we read just a moment ago, The Shroud, we have the exposition or the introduction of the mother, and we know that she has a little child, and the powerful love she has towards her child. And that's why, you know, she cried a lot, and she was very sad about the loss of her son or the death of her son. Okay, so that's the exposition. Exposition usually reveals some source or seed of potential conflict in the initial situation, of which the characters may be as yet unaware. In the Trudeau's cartoon, the contrast between the talkative teacher who expect an independent thought for those, whatever, go to the last 2 lines. So too does the Grimm's statement that the mother worshipped her baby or her boy above everything. This is the exposition or the introduction of the short story, that there is a mother who loves her child above everything. And remember, above God too, because God who takes her child. Now, the second part is the rising action. The rising action, it's like, you know, going up in the story, or when the conflict becomes very complicated. Rising action, by suggesting a conflict, exposition may blend into the second phase of the plot, the rising action, which begins with inciting incidents or destabilizing events Okay, that is some action that destabilizes the initial situation and incites open conflict, as does the death of the little boy in the second sentence of the folktale. Now, I think I don't know. I think that the death of the boy may be considered as the as the climax, but here it says here as the death of the little boy in the second sentence of the folktale. Typically, what keeps the action rising is a complication. So, and that's why, you know, the story, you know, keeps getting complicated, complicated. This is called the rising action, the rising action. Okay, an event that introduces a new conflict or intensifies an existing one. So the complication is that we have an introduction to a new conflict or an intensification of an existing one. This happens in the third sentence of the shroud, when the mother begins to see her little boy every night, although he is dead and buried. The climax or the turning point, the plot's climax or the turning point, is the moment of the greatest emotional intensity. Notice the way bold-faced lettering appears and exclamation points replace question marks in the second to last panel of the Doonesbury strip. The climax is also the moment when the outcome of the plot and the fate of the characters and the fate of characters are decided. Okay, this is a definition, and also is the moment of the greatest emotional intensity. That's also the climax. Okay, a climax does tend to be literally pivotal incidents. Pivotal means the most important or the highest incident that turns things around or involves in Aristotle where the change from one state of things to its opposite. The shroud reaches its climax when the mother stops crying after her little boy tells her that the grief is what keeps him from sleeping and that peaceful sleep is what he craves. I think this is not the climax. This is the sorry. This is called the falling action, because I think the most important thing is the loss of her child. That's the climax or the turning point. And that's why, you know, she moves from the state of happiness to the state of sadness because of the loss of her child. And that's why I think this is the highest point in the story, which is the climax. Okay, so here, as in many plots, so the turning point involves a discovery or a new insight or event. Epiphany, and this is the definition of epiphany, is the turning point that involves the discovery of a new insight or an event. Also, an epiphany or a sudden revelation of truth inspired by seemingly trivial events. Okay, that's called epiphany. You have to know this word because it's very important. What epiphany means? Epiphany means the sudden revelation or the sudden realization of truth. The sudden revelation or realization of truth. As a result, turning points often involve internal or psychological events, even if they are compared by and lead to the external action. In the shroud, for instance, the mother's new insight results in different behavior. She wept no more. Sometimes, though, critics differentiate between the story's climax and the crisis that precedes and precipitates it. In the shroud, for example, these critics would describe the crisis as the moment when the son confronts the mother with the information that implicitly requires her to make a choice. The climax as the moment when she makes it. This distinction might be especially helpful when you grapple with longer works of fiction in which much more time and action intervenes between the crisis and the climax. The falling action. Okay, so the falling action here, when the things start to get, you know, easier, and when things start to get, you know, better. Okay, the falling action brings a release of emotion, tension, and moves us towards the resolution of the conflict or conflicts. This release occurs in the shroud when the boy speaks for the second and last time, assuring his mother that her more peaceful demeanor is giving him peace as well. So simply when the boy told his mother that she should stop crying, and the mother stopped crying, now things are getting better for the boy, and the mother stopped, you know, crying. And this is the falling action, when things start to become less complicated and less, you know, problematic. In some works of fiction, resolution achieved through an utterly unexpected twist, as in meanwhile unknown to our hero, the Marine were just on the other side of the hell, or Suzanne rolled over in the bed and realized the whole thing had been just a dream. Such a device, sometimes called a Deus Ex Makina. This Latin term literally means God out of machine, and derives from the ancient theatrical practice of using a machine to lower into the stage God who solves the problem and of the human character. So this is the definition of Deus Ex Machina. What is Deus Ex Machina? This term is a Latin term, okay? This is a Latin term. And it means that sometimes the story ends suddenly. How the story ends suddenly? Because it's just happened, like that's the end of it. Like, you know, as we have here in this example, Suzanne rolled over in the bed and realized that the whole thing had been just a dream. So you are dreaming, and you have, like, you know, a crazy story where you have conflict and fighting and all crazy stuff, and all of a sudden you wake up. Now everything goes away. The story goes away, the conflict goes away, everything goes away. So the story comes to an end. So this sudden end of the story is called Deus Ex Machina, which means in Latin, God out of machine, means that this is like an intervention from God, that God makes you, or that makes this story ends, okay? So some writers do this and end the story suddenly without, you know, falling action, just they end it, and that's the end of the story. That's called the Deus Ex Machina. Okay, the last part of the plot is the conclusion. Finally, just the plot begins with a situation that is later destabilized. So its conclusion represents us with a new and at least somewhat stable situation, one that gives a sense of closure because the conflict or conflicts have been resolved. So simply, the conclusion is that one that gives us a sense of closure because the conflict or conflicts have been resolved, if only temporarily and not necessarily in the way the character had expected. In The Shroud, the resolution comes in the last sentence, in which the mother bears her grief quietly and patiently, and the child quietly sleeps his last sleep. So if you remember the story that we read before, when the mother stopped crying and the child started to sleep quietly, this is the end of the story, and this is the resolution, okay? Or the end of the story, or the conclusion. All right, so I think, sorry. Oops. What is going on? What happened? I think there's something wrong. Okay, so this is the conclusion. Sometimes you have such words that also mean the conclusion, like the epilogue and also the denouement. Okay, these are the epilogue or the denouement. Okay, you have to also read about these. Some fictional works may also include the final section called an epilogue, which ties up loose ends left dangling in the conclusion proper, updates us on what has happened to the characters since their conflicts were resolved, and or provides some sort of commentary on the story's larger significance. An epilogue is thus like the little paragraph in here, which comes after we have concluded our discussions of the 5 phases of the plot, but still feel that there is some more terms that we deal with. So simply the epilogue is something that comes within the conclusion, and it comes at the end of the conclusion, where you try to cover some things that you don't cover, okay? So the epilogue is part of the conclusion, but it comes in the end of the conclusion, where it covers some terms that we did not touch on or we did not discuss. And denouement, in discussion of the plot, you will very often encounter the French word denouement, literally mean untying or as of not. In this anthology, however, we generally try to avoid using denouement because it can be and often is used in 3 different, potentially contradictory ways, as a synonymous for falling action, as a synonymous for conclusion or resolution. Now, because here the denouement can mean falling action, conclusion, and resolution. as mentioned here in this book, they try to avoid using this term. And that's why, you know, it is not, it's not discussed thoroughly. Okay, so this is the last page that we are going to talk about: plot summary and example and exercise. Although any good plot summary should be relatively brief recounting of what happened in a work of fiction, it need not necessarily tell what happened in the same order that the work itself does. As a result, many plot summaries, in fact, more like an action summary in the sense that we define the terms action and plot in this book. But unless you have a good reason for recording events, it is generally a good idea to follow the plot. The following plot summary of Raymond. Okay, so this is an example of how the plot is summarized here that you can read by yourself and see how the plot is summarized. Now try this yourself, choose, okay, I think this is not important for you to know, so I would rather you skip this. Okay, I think, guys, this is the end of it. This is the end of our presentation. So let me just, you know, wrap up things and try to conclude what we have discussed. First of all, we have discussed the plot, and we said that the plot is the arrangement of events in a story, but there is a difference between a plot and action, because action talks about the historical happenings of events, whereas the plot, it does not talk about the history of the events. It talks about how the author arranges these events and what the intention of the author to arrange these events in this way. Okay. Yeah, and also we talked about the 5 parts of the plot: the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the conclusion. So these are the 5 parts of the plot, and I discussed them in detail before. So I want you to read this a story of an hour and try to locate the 5 parts of the plot in the story that I assign you. Okay, so go to e-learning, check the assignments, and try to locate the 5 parts of the plot. Sorry, you know, for this presentation, you know, it may seem that has some disconnection and disruption. This is simply because in Amman we have many, you know, street, you know, sellers, and they come and sell stuff in the streets and they make some noise, and that's why I got some interruption when I explain things. I'm sorry for that, and try to find a very quiet room in the future. Thank you very much, guys, for watching, and have a wonderful day.